somewhere beyond the sky, a meeting is taking place. Not a metaphor, not a vision, a meeting. Beings the text calls the sons of God are gathering to present themselves before the Lord, and walking in among them, uninvited, unannounced, and yet somehow not turned away, is a figure the text calls the Satan, the accuser. He is standing in the throne room of the God of Israel, and nobody stops him. This is the moment the book of Job opens with. No warning, no explanation, just a courtroom scene in heaven, and the last being you would expect walking straight into the middle of it. And the question this leaves behind is one that has unsettled readers for thousands of years. If God is holy, if God's presence is described elsewhere in Scripture as so overwhelming that no one can look at it and live, then how does the accuser of humanity get an audience? This is case file number 2, the accuser at the council. And before we go further, a note on method. What we are about to examine is one of the most speculated about scenes in the entire Bible. So, we are going to move carefully. We will separate what the text actually says from what centuries of theology have layered on top of it. Where Scripture is silent, we will say so. Where it speaks plainly, we will follow it exactly. This is not a sermon. It is an investigation. And an investigation only works if you are honest about what you don't know. The book of Job opens not with Job himself, but with heaven. Job chapter 1, verse 6. One day the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came with them. That single sentence contains almost everything that will unsettle theologians for the rest of history: the sons of God. In the Hebrew Bible, this phrase, Bene Ha-Elohim, does not refer to human beings. It refers to members of the heavenly realm. Some translations render it angels. The text is describing what many scholars call a divine council, a gathering of heavenly beings assembled before God's throne, the way a king's court might assemble before him. This is not speculation. The structure is right there in the text, and it echoes similar scenes elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible, in Isaiah 6, in Daniel 7, in the opening of Psalm 82, where God is described as taking his place in the divine council and rendering judgment. So the setting itself is not unusual for Hebrew literature. A heavenly council convening before God is a recognized biblical scene. What is unusual is who else shows up. Satan also came with them. The Hebrew here is not a proper name. It is Ha-Satan with the definite article. Literally, the Satan. Not Satan as a name, the way we use it today, but a title, a function, a role. The word Satan means accuser or adversary, someone who opposes, someone who brings a legal charge against another. In several Old Testament passages, the word is used for human adversaries as well. In the book of Numbers, an angel of the Lord stands in Balaam's path as an adversary, the same word. The term does not automatically mean a supernatural being. Context has to tell you that. But here, the context is clear. This is a member of the heavenly assembly, and his function within that assembly appears to be exactly what his title says: to accuse. God asks him where he has come from, and the Satan answers, from roaming through the earth and going back and forth in it. Then God asks something that changes the entire trajectory of the story. Have you considered my servant Job? There is no one on earth like him. He is blameless and upright, a man who fears God and shuns evil. And the Satan answers with a challenge. Job only serves you, he says, because you have blessed him. Take it away, strike everything he has, and he will curse you to your face, and God allows it. Very well then, the Lord says. Everything he has is in your power, but on the man himself do not lay a finger. Notice precisely what just happened. God did not lose control of the situation. God set the terms, the boundary, the limit. The Satan does not act until permission is granted, and he does not act beyond the boundary that is set. When Job's health is later attacked in chapter 2, the same structure repeats. God again sets the limit. You must spare his life. This is worth sitting with, because it is easy to read this story and walk away with the impression that Satan is a rival power negotiating with God as something close to an equal. The text does not support that. Every single action the Satan takes in this story happens inside a permission he was given and a boundary he does not cross. He proposes. He does not decide. He accuses. He does not rule. The throne in this scene never changes occupants. So, who is this figure exactly? Here the investigation has to be careful, because the Old Testament gives us far less detail about the Satan than later Jewish and Christian tradition eventually built around him. In the Hebrew Bible, Ha-Satan appears by that title in only a small number of passages, most prominently here in Job, and in Zechariah chapter 3, which we will examine shortly. The picture the text gives is narrow and specific, a being who functions as a prosecutor, someone whose role, at least in these scenes, is to test claims of righteousness and bring accusation against human beings before God. This lines up with an ancient legal picture that would have made intuitive sense to the original audience. Israelite society had courts, and courts had accusers, people whose job was to bring charges, to challenge a defendant's claim of innocence, to argue the other side of the case. The heavenly council, in this scene, functions the same way. God is depicted as sovereign judge. The sons of God are the assembly, and the Satan is functioning, at least in this moment, in the role of prosecuting attorney. This does not mean the Old Testament presents the Satan as a comfortable or morally neutral figure. His challenge to God about Job is corrosive. It suggests that righteousness is never real, only self-interest wearing a mask, and the suffering Job experiences as a direct result of that challenge is severe. And, from Job's human vantage point, inside the story, senseless. But it is important to be precise about what the text claims and what it does not. Job 1-2 does not give us an origin story for Satan. It does not explain a primordial rebellion. It does not describe him ruling a kingdom of darkness in opposition to God's kingdom of light. Those ideas exist in Scripture. They simply come from other passages, other eras of revelation, and later theological development, which we will look at further into this investigation. Reading them back into the 2 chapters of Job where this scene occurs is an interpretive move, not a textual one. What Job 1-2 gives us, and only this, is a figure whose role in this particular scene is accusation, operating inside, not outside, the authority of God. If there is one thing this scene is not ambiguous about, it is who is in charge. Every stage of the negotiation in Job 1 and 2 follows the same pattern. God raises Job's name first. The Satan does not initiate the encounter with an accusation against Job out of nowhere. God draws attention to him. The Satan responds with a challenge. God sets the boundary of what is permitted. The Satan operates strictly inside that boundary. This structure repeats twice, once in chapter 1 and again in chapter 2, and both times the outcome is identical. Nothing happens to Job that God does not first authorize. This matters because of what it rules out. It rules out a reading in which Satan is an independent cosmic force capable of acting on his own initiative against God's will. In the world of Job, he cannot even touch Job's donkeys without asking first. It is worth comparing this to how Satan is sometimes popularly imagined, as a being whose power roughly rivals God's, locked in an eternal struggle where the outcome is genuinely uncertain. The text of Job does not support that picture. What it supports is something closer to a subordinate whose actions are permitted, bounded, and ultimately answerable. A creature operating entirely within the authority of the one true sovereign. This is a claim the whole book seems designed to protect. Job's suffering is real. His questions are real. But the narrator never once allows the reader to wonder whether God has actually lost control of events. The tension in the story is emotional and theological. Why would a good God allow this? Not a tension about who is actually in charge. That much stays fixed from the first verse to the last. This is where the investigation has to slow down, because here we move from what the text states directly into the territory of interpretation. And it is important to mark that transition clearly. The Bible does not give an explicit, stated reason for why God permits this confrontation. Job himself never learns the reason. That is, arguably, one of the central points of the book. Job never finds out about the conversation in heaven that caused his suffering. The reader knows something Job never knows. So any answer to why did God allow this is, at best, a reasoned inference from the shape of the story, not a citation of a verse that answers the question directly. Scholars and theologians have proposed several possibilities. None of them should be presented as settled doctrine. Here are the primary ones. The first possibility is that the scene exists to demonstrate the reality of righteousness that is not transactional. The Satan's accusation is specific. Job only fears God because it is profitable to do so. Strip away the profit, he argues, and the devotion disappears. If that is true, it would mean that no creature can genuinely love or trust God for God's own sake, only for benefits received. The test under this reading exists to settle that question, and Job's endurance, flawed, angry, honest, but ultimately unbroken, becomes the answer. The second possibility is that the scene exists to expose a layer of reality that is normally hidden from human perception entirely. Throughout the rest of the book, Job and his friends argue endlessly about why he is suffering, and every single one of their theories is wrong, because none of them have access to chapter 1. The reader is given a glimpse behind the curtain that the characters inside the story never receive. Under this reading, part of the purpose of the scene is to show the audience that human suffering sometimes has causes that are not visible from the ground, that there is a dimension to events that exceeds what any human observer, however wise, can fully diagnose. The third possibility is that the scene functions primarily to display God's sovereignty rather than to explain suffering at all. Under this reading, the point is not really about Job and not really about Satan. The point is to show that even the accuser of humanity operates within limits God alone sets, that nothing, including the forces that seem most chaotic and destructive in human experience, is finally outside the authority of the God of Israel. These three readings are not mutually exclusive, and serious interpreters across centuries have combined them in different proportions. What none of them can claim is direct textual proof. The Book of Job asks its readers to sit inside uncertainty about final causes, which may itself be part of what the book is trying to teach. The scene in Job is not the only place in the Hebrew Bible where the accuser stands before the Lord. Centuries later, after the Babylonian exile, the prophet Zechariah records a vision, and in it the same figure appears again. In a strikingly similar courtroom setting, Zechariah chapter 3, verse 1. Then he showed me Joshua the high priest standing before the angel of the Lord, and Satan standing at his right side to accuse him. Once again, a heavenly setting. Once again, Hasatan, functioning exactly as his title describes, standing in the position of an accuser, at the defendant's right hand, which in ancient legal custom was the position from which formal accusation was brought. Joshua is not accused of a specific crime named in the text. Instead, the vision shows him dressed in filthy clothes, a symbol, in context, of guilt or unworthiness, likely tied to the corporate sin of Israel that Joshua, as high priest, represented before God. And here is where the vision turns. Verse 2. The Lord said to Satan, "The Lord rebuke you, Satan. The Lord who has chosen Jerusalem rebuke you. Is not this man a burning stick snatched from the fire?" The accusation is not allowed to stand. God rebukes the accuser directly, and then does something the accuser did not ask for and could not grant. He removes Joshua's filthy clothes and replaces them with clean garments, declaring, "See, I have taken away your sin." The parallels to Job are immediate. A heavenly court, the accuser present at God's own initiative, or at least with God's full awareness. A charge brought against a human being. And in both cases, the final outcome does not belong to the accuser. It belongs entirely to God. But the differences matter too, and a careful investigation has to name them rather than smooth them over. In Job, the accusation is permitted to proceed, and Job suffers as a direct result. The text does not show God overruling the challenge, only bounding it. In Zechariah, the accusation is directly overruled and reversed, and the accused party is not merely spared, but actively cleansed and restored. Ride side by side, the two scenes present something like two movements of the same theological argument. In Job, the accuser's charge is tested, and in the end, does not hold. Job does not curse God, even in his darkest moment, though the text lets us watch the possibility hang in the air for chapter after chapter. In Zechariah, the accuser's charge is not even permitted to reach a verdict. It is overruled outright on the basis of God's own choice and initiative, not on the basis of the defendant's merit. Joshua does not argue his own innocence in the text. He says nothing at all. The rescue is entirely God's action. Whether these two scenes are meant to be read as a developing picture, accusation tested, and then accusation overruled by grace, is an interpretive judgment. The text does not explicitly connect the two passages to each other, but the resemblance is too precise to be coincidence, and readers across Jewish and Christian tradition alike have long noticed it. The title does not disappear after the Old Testament. It resurfaces centuries later in one of the most vivid scenes in the book of Revelation. Revelation chapter 12, verse 10, a voice from heaven declares, "Now have come the salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God and the authority of his Messiah. For the accuser of our brothers and sisters, who accuses them before our God day and night, has been hurled down." Here, explicitly, the New Testament identifies the accuser using language that directly echoes the Hebrew ha-Satan as one who has been accusing believers before our God day and night. This is significant, and it deserves to be stated plainly. The New Testament itself draws the connection between accusation and the ongoing activity of Satan. This is not solely a modern interpretive leap. Revelation 12 explicitly describes Satan functioning, up until the moment described in this vision, in a role that mirrors what we saw in Job and Zechariah, standing, in some sense, in the presence of God, bringing accusation against human beings. What Revelation adds, and this is where the investigation has to be precise about what is stated and what is inferred, is a turning point. The passage describes the accuser being hurled down, no longer having a place from which to accuse. The immediate context ties this event to the blood of the Lamb, a reference to the death of Christ, and to the word of their testimony, the perseverance of believers under persecution. What the text does not do is explicitly draw a straight line back to Job chapter 1 and say, this is the same event. This closes the account opened there. That connection, that the accuser's access described in Job and Zechariah, is the same access finally revoked in Revelation 12, is a theological inference many interpreters have drawn, and a reasonable one given the shared vocabulary and shared courtroom imagery across all three texts. But it is an inference built by connecting texts across nearly 1,000 years of biblical writing, not a citation the Bible makes explicitly itself. This is where the investigation runs directly into one of the more genuinely unresolved questions in Christian theological history, and honesty requires laying out the disagreement rather than picking a side and presenting it as settled. Several New Testament passages describe some kind of decisive defeat, fall, or removal of Satan, and they do not all appear to describe the same moment in the same way. Luke chapter 10, verse 18. Jesus, after sending out 72 disciples who return reporting successful ministry, says, "I saw Satan fall like lightning from heaven." The statement is brief, and its precise meaning has been debated. Some read it as describing a primordial fall from a time before human history, others as describing something happening in real time tied to the success of Jesus' ministry, and others as a proclamation of what Christ's coming would ultimately accomplish, stated in advance. John chapter 12, verse 31, spoken by Jesus shortly before his crucifixion. Now is the time for judgment on this world. Now the prince of this world will be driven out. Here the language is future-oriented but imminent, tied explicitly to the events of the cross that are about to unfold. The letter to the Hebrews, chapter 2, describes Christ's death as being so that by his death he might break the power of him who holds the power of death, that is, the devil, framing the cross as the decisive act that disarms, though does not necessarily state instantly and totally remove, the adversary's power. And Revelation 12, as we saw, describes the accuser being hurled down in a vision that most scholars agree describes, in symbolic form, the meaning and consequence of Christ's death and resurrection, though Revelation's imagery notoriously resists being pinned to a single, simple timeline. Put these four passages side by side and a genuine question emerges. Is this one single event, described four different ways, or several distinct movements, a heavenly demotion described in different terms, a legal disarming at the cross, and a final future removal still to come, which other New Testament passages describe using imagery of Satan's ultimate end? Christian interpreters have not agreed, and it would be dishonest to present one answer as the obvious biblical conclusion. Some traditions read all of these texts as describing the single, unified victory of the cross, experienced and described from different angles. Others distinguish between a decisive defeat accomplished at the cross and a final, future removal that has not yet occurred, pointing to passages later in Revelation that describe Satan being active for a short time, even after this heavenly fall, and only permanently removed at the very end of the biblical narrative, in Revelation 20. What can be said without controversy is this: every New Testament passage that addresses the subject agrees on the direction of the story. Whatever access or authority the accuser had, the New Testament consistently presents it as diminishing, being legally overturned, and ultimately ending, not increasing, and never rivaling God's authority at any point along the way. Return, now, to the question this file opened with. If Satan is the enemy of God's people, why does he appear standing inside God's own court, seemingly unopposed? Having followed the evidence through Job, through Zechariah, through Revelation, and through the disputed timeline of the New Testament, the text supports a specific and consistent answer, even while leaving some of the details around it genuinely open. The Bible never presents Satan as a power equal to God, competing for control of the universe on comparable terms. Every scene in which he appears before God, he appears as a subordinate, summoned or permitted, not sovereign, accusing, not ruling, bounded by explicit limits he does not have the power to cross. In Job, he cannot act without permission. In Zechariah, his accusation is simply overruled, without negotiation, the moment God chooses to overrule it. In Revelation, he is finally described as being removed from the position he once occupied entirely. What the scene in Job actually dramatizes, then, is not a fair fight between two comparable powers. It is closer to a courtroom where one figure has the standing to bring a charge and only one figure has the authority to render a verdict. And the text never once confuses which is which. Beyond that baseline, three real, live interpretive questions remain open, and honest scholarship holds them as open. Why God permits the accusation to be tested at all in Job, rather than overruling it outright the way he does in Zechariah, is not something the text explains directly. Only three plausible, non-exclusive reasons, none stated as fact by the text itself, whether the heavenly council scenes in Job and Zechariah and the fall language in the Gospels and Revelation describe the same reality at different points in a single unfolding story, or separate movements loosely connected by shared imagery, is a matter of ongoing, unresolved interpretation across Christian tradition. And exactly when? At the cross, in the ministry of Jesus, or only at history's final page? The accuser's access to the heavenly court is fully and finally closed, is a question the New Testament itself seems to describe from more than one angle, without collapsing those angles into a single stated timeline. What the book of Job does not leave open is its central claim. Whatever else remains unresolved about the timeline, the nature of the accuser, or the reason God allows the test to proceed, the book is not, finally, a book about how powerful Satan is. It is a book about how Job, stripped of everything, still refuses to let go of a relationship with a God he can no longer explain. And it is a book that opens with a scene explicitly designed to show its readers something the story's own suffering man never gets to see. That even in the darkest, most senseless chapter of a human life, nothing is happening outside the authority of the one sitting on the throne. The accuser gets to speak in that room. He does not get to rule it. And perhaps that is the real center of this case file. Not a settled answer to why the accuser was allowed to stand there at all, but the sober, tested claim underneath the whole scene, that whatever power evil is permitted to exercise in this world, it exercises on a leash it did not choose, held by a hand it does not control. The case remains open. The verdict on the throne does not.